Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon from India. Good morning, good evening, depending on your part of the world. My name is Laknath Jayasinghe. I'm delighted, absolutely thrilled to be moderating this session on ungendering gender. We'll talk a bit more about that as part of the OP Jindal Global Universities World University Summit 2021. And this session is called Universities of the the theme of the theme of the session is called Ungendering Universities. Hugely provocative and fascinating topic, talking about promoting equality and awareness through gender-sensitive policies in the higher education space. We have an esteemed panel with us today. We have I'm going to speak from my left and move around as I see the panel. We've got Professor Rupamanjari Ghosh, Vice Chancellor, Shiv Nadar University. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome. We've got Helen Nicholson, University of Otago, New Zealand. Hello, welcome. We've got Professor Rekha Datta, who comes to us from the US. She's the Interim Provost, hello, and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at Monmouth University in the United States. And then we have, from my part of the world actually, Professor Carolyn Evans, who's Vice Chancellor of Griffith University in Brisbane in Australia. So I'm really, really thrilled. We've got a fascinating panel here to talk about gender politics and so on within the university, structurally, conceptually, and so on. The format for today is just going to be, I'm going to introduce the topic and then we'll very much go into, probably it'll be about 35 to 40 minutes of a Q&A session, teasing out some of the larger concerns. Actually, we could tease out some of the macro, global and micro local issues as you all see gender being discussed and practiced at your institutions across different geographies. I mean, we've got India, we've got New Zealand, we've got the United States of America, and we've got Australia to tease out as well. So let me just give you, to those who aren't familiar with the theme, let me just give you a bit of a background and then we can move straight into some of the unpack, should I say, some of the issues of today. So I guess when we talk about ungendering universities, the basic premise to start from would be that pluralistic thoughts and social diversity are indeed, the bedrock of life and learning in contemporary global universities. And we see that in many parts of the world, whether it's here in India, the discussions are starting to emerge in Australia, in the United States, in some parts of Europe indeed, right? And in New Zealand. And so in upholding these values, right, universities must reflect on the translation of the best aspirations of their societies in, and indeed, when we talk about the university sector, we're really talking about translating these ideas into excellence in teaching and research, democratic leadership in terms of, enabling the transformative vision to take place, maintaining academic, social, and industry collaborations. And so what we're really talking about is the promotion of a work culture, not just for employees, but for our students and other stakeholders as well, that are free of the biases and discriminations, and which ought to have critical attributes embedded within. So gender equality, in a way, plays a huge aspect, an important role in the creative outcomes of a university's culture. And as well, we see through such endeavors, such discussions, to promote the agenda of justice and equity in society. Universities themselves, we could argue, ought to be microcosms. We should be leading. Well, should we be leading? That's one of the questions we can throw out. Should be leading in terms of the microcosms of future workspaces, where we expect high standards of fairness, justice, equity to facilitate themselves and to be practiced through leadership positions. For example, we might even talk about equity in leadership positions in far greater numbers and the development of, for example, young academics of all genders being a key institutional priority. As well as that, a diverse staff and student body would actually, help strengthen universities' research and students' learning, right? So there needs to be a reimagination of a gender-sensitive approach toward policy formulation within the higher education space. And these policies should raise awareness about these issues and also communicate the right messages. So this session, over the next 45 or so minutes, will examine how to ungender. Really interesting term. It sort of implies that universities are gendered, right? And that's probably a nice point to start off with. So the session examines how to ungender universities and the steps needed to uphold the equality of opportunity, inclusivity, and well-being of staff and students and other stakeholders, whilst ensuring that the best amongst them flourish within the university community. So that's sort of setting the scene, I guess, for the discussions that we're going to take place, that we're looking to take place today. And I'm going to start off by throwing to the panel the first question, from my point of view. So let's throw this to the panel. Perhaps you can spend about 3 minutes-ish trying to answer the questions around what are your main concerns as you see it from your perspective, your country, your institution, regarding gender inequalities in higher education. And this is in the context of, given, in contemporary academic settings, the constant evolution in the spectrum of gender diversity. How are these, for example, inequalities growing? Do you see them growing or narrowing, for example? And where do you see, for example, this as being a sharp issue say, in my country, in Australia, more recently, in the higher education discourse? Where do you see the fault lines in this respect? So I'm going to throw it over to the panel. Perhaps we could start off with Professor, I'm just going from literally my top left and working around. I'll go the other way around, anti-clockwise for some of the questions. So we'll start off with Professor Ghosh. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that very nice, setting of the context. So I'll take your question, and I think I'll go quickly because I'm sort of eager to hear others. So let me talk about India and our context. That's what you asked me. So let me say what I see is really my main concern regarding gender inequality. So in India, officially stated hiring policies or other policies have no gender bias. Official norms and procedures are not discriminating. So you'd think everything is hunky-dory. So here, the discrimination is subtle and indirect. And I see that's my major concern. So I'll give you the summary and then I'll elaborate on that. So essentially what I'm concerned about is conscious and unconscious biases, the unstated discriminations. Let me elaborate on that. That change, I feel, is a multi-layered process which requires persistent efforts and the right approach. So policies and compliance are just a part of change. So what I mean is that universities should develop a culture, a work culture that is supportive of its goals and exactly along the lines you stated. The third point I want to make is that we need to start at the beginning. The magic cannot happen suddenly at the university level. Though I think we do take a leadership role in molding the thoughts, but the problem is deep-rooted when you are talking about something so indirect. Because if the policy was discriminatory, my job would be very simple. I would just change the policy. The problem lies elsewhere. It's a much more subtle problem. So the perception, for example, you see in India that only certain types of soft jobs are appropriate for women, right? First restrict them to school and now college teaching or some secretarial work. This perception has stated, you don't, and the other mistake I think we make is talk about work-life balance. And somehow why it's stuck to women, I don't understand. I suppose it's true for all human beings with families, right? I don't think you should ever try to strike a balance. Then it leads to mediocrity. It's not either or, it's not even balancing the two. It's sometimes this, sometimes that, and most of the time it's both. And you figure it out. So you actually give your best to both. And if you try to balance, you actually end up in being mediocre. And that's what is the main problem I see. So I think, as you said, Laknath, that if we start talking about it, I really have a lot to say, but maybe I'll wait for this. So the point I'm making is also that the professional world is tough enough for both men and women, or any gender you talk about. But there are additional barriers that are maybe unintentionally put up along the career path of women. Some women ignore them and move on. And that is often at a very high personal cost. And I think so if I have to create a culture and I have to make people conscious of it, this has to be stated. If you look at it in a very simple way that I preach at SNU, for example, a lot, that each individual is unique. And a real challenge in an institution of higher learning like ours is to frame and support is the key word here, policies and systems that cater to and respect the uniqueness and choices of an individual, whatever you are, man or woman or whatever.
Yeah.
It's not just about treating men and women equally, it's about understanding the differences rationally and making the working atmosphere comfortable. So it's really, I don't have to be like anybody else. There is a study, I'm a physicist, you know that. There's a study done in physics. I mean, it's such a male-dominated subject. And the end result, because I'll not take too long to say that it was pointed out that we continue to treat girls as they are proto boys. I mean, you don't have to be like anybody else. You have to be just yourself. And that is going to enrich higher education institutions. And the moment we start understanding that and work towards it, and understand the diversity that you talked about, there was a Harvard Business Review in November 2016. The title of the paper was "Diverse Teams Are Smarter." So you don't have to do it. I mean, it was for businesses, but it applies to higher education institutions as well, the way I see it. So it's something like the diverse teams are smarter. So it's not like you do because it's the right thing to do. If you do the right thing, then it makes business sense. And I think that's why the society should care more than just doing the right thing. So I think, I'll stop here and maybe take your other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rupamanjari. They were fascinating introductory comments, and I'm just jotting down, and my page is already scattered with concepts to jump off from. And it was really interesting. You spoke about the Indian perspective here, and I'm just going to throw it over to, again, as I said, I'm going clockwise here on my screen. I'm going to throw it over to Helen. We've heard some insights from India. Indeed, do you see some of the same things playing out from your viewpoint in the Antipodes in New Zealand, at Otago in particular? What Professor Ghosh mentioned about conscious and unconscious bias, perhaps, or indeed, do we need to, from a New Zealand point of view, start at the beginning? So I'll throw it over to you to take it forward.
Okay. I think a lot of what I was going to say is similar to Professor Ghosh. If I reflect on when I was a student, gender was very simple. It was a binary issue. It's no longer that. And for New Zealand, it is coping with, or how do we understand and how do we work across the variety of genders that we now have? So I think that's an issue. I also think it is around culture. It's about that culture of inclusiveness, which is not just about gender, but it's about race and many other factors. And that needs to start at the beginning. It needs to start with the families and the communities and lead through into the university.
So if I can just quickly tease out some here, are you talking then that it's the intersection of genders with, as you said, class, race, and so on? Do you see that being the discussion or some of the prominent discussions?
I'm not sure that they are contributing factors which sometimes intersect and sometimes are separate. And that view that Professor Ghosh was saying, talking about that the need that to recognize every one of us as an individual and to work to make them and help, particularly in the student space, those people become the best they can, and to recognize that they are individuals and we don't have to do everything the same way. So I think that's one thing. I think in the New Zealand situation, we are seeing more female academics coming through and more coming up to professorial level. And if we look at the university level, of the 8 universities, we only have 8 in New Zealand, 4 of them have female vice chancellors. So in terms of the message that's giving, that's quite strong. The other concern that I have in New Zealand is our student population. So we now have a situation where we have more women than men as students. And the females often do better academically, particularly in the earlier years, than the boys. So we have a concern around how do we get more men to come into universities and how do we balance that? So it's really over the last 40 years, the tide has turned from being a predominantly male cohort of students to an increasingly female cohort.
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. And I guess, it throws up all sorts of other issues about, employment opportunities and some of the broader discussions we've seen in the press, I guess, in the Australian New Zealand space about gender and the access of education to boys and girls. Yeah, thank you. Professor Rekha, how do you see things in the US? We've heard from 2 different parts of the world here. And, do you indeed see some of the commonalities, or are there differences perhaps? Particularly, I was interested to hear that Professor Nicholson talked about, the increasing diversity of genders, and the acceptance of that creates other issues that the university sector needs to deal with. How do you see things from your viewpoint?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and hats off to OP Jindal for doing this, putting this together at a time when it's much needed. I actually have, if I were to look at it, kind of lend a multi-layered or a multi-pronged approach to this. My research, I'm a political scientist, more of a sociology and political science approach I take. And actually, I had visited Jindal a few years ago, and my research was gender-based violence. And I took at that, for that project and also elsewhere, education to be a vehicle that would help women overcome different kinds of gender-based violence. And so there is that systemic, cultural, if you will, aspect of education, which is very critical for gender empowerment. So when I look at it from a global perspective, I do see, for example, more than 60 million girls are out of school. So just access becomes an issue. I mention access because, when we are focusing on the leadership issue, we have to also focus on the entry level. Or are girls coming to school? Do they have access? Do they have obstacles? And we can talk about policies. And I know Dr. Ghosh mentioned policies. I've done a bit of work with UN Millennium Development Goals as well as Sustainable Development Goals. And globally, there's a lot of effort going on there. When I'm looking at the United States and, the place where I'm living and working, I have other concerns, and one of the concerns is has to do with intersections, and especially who is coming to our universities, colleges, and universities. As you may have read in the trade press, there is a real growing concern about diversity as something of a trend which is developing. And when you look at it in terms of enrollment, colleges and universities are facing a downturn in the projections of enrollment. And also there is a strong possibility of colleges really having to attract, for various reasons, ethically, in terms of reality, in terms of just sheer numbers, a number of students from diverse backgrounds. And so policy-wise, universities have to start looking at, and have started looking at, how do we create and also nurture an environment which is welcoming and inclusive. So that's one part of the issue. The other part, kind of connected to that, and maybe in post-COVID it's becoming more of a challenge, is the race class division or access coming in terms of affordability. So if numbers are suggesting that we are going to have more students from diverse backgrounds, are they also going to be able to afford a college education? So that's a question that institutions of higher ed are kind of struggling with. The other part that I wanted to mention, and we can come back to some of the discussions, I'm just throwing out a few of the major concerns, as you put it. And the other one that I have is something that was already mentioned briefly, and this is true about the United States as well, and that is, just in very, in some ways, in contrast to what I just mentioned, we do find, in terms of the global trends in the United States, just like in New Zealand, that is called kind of the other gender gap. So in an article in 2019 in Inside Higher Ed, some of the data suggests that in every area, like bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, doctoral degrees, women earn more than 50%, sometimes closer to 60% of the degrees compared to men. And so since 1982, women have earned 13 million more degrees than men in the United States. So this kind of goes with another trend. In 2006, a New Republic article also talked about what is called the boy trouble. And that is girls consistently outperforming boys. And so we are seeing that. Yet, when you come to leadership positions, yes, there are more women entering, but even in terms of completing PhDs and then taking on academic jobs, we do find that the data suggests that many women are either choosing alternate careers or not really pursuing either an academic career or a leadership position. So that is another trend that needs to be something that is a concern of mine, as well as others in higher ed, looking at it from the US perspective. So I'll just pause there to just allow for other voices, as well as I'd like to see more questions and engage in the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Rekha. They're wonderful issues you've thrown up, and I can relate, from, my circle of friends from Australia. I can see some of those issues very clearly coming through. I'm going to throw it to Professor Carolyn Evans to talk about things from Australia. And, you've sort of, in a way, you've seen, you've got that the ability to compare and sort of see things through from the Indian, the New Zealand, and the American perspective. So over to you, Carolyn. How are things from your viewpoint at Griffith?
Thank you. Can I begin, as we often do in Australia, by acknowledging that I'm talking to you today from the lands of the Kumameri Ngunnawal people of the Yugambeh Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and particularly acknowledging the role that women have played in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander society in Australia. Sadly, often and I begin with this partly as a sign of respect, and partly because I think it has been one of the real issues we face in Australia is we've seen enormous strides. You know, when I was an undergraduate, I remember the first woman professor in the law school. And, oh, you know, this is such an exciting moment. Now here in Queensland, where we have 8 universities, 6 of them are led by female vice chancellors, but we're all white, we're all able-bodied, we're all straight. We're mothers. The first generation were not. It was almost impossible to be a mother and get a leadership role for the generation above mine. But I think one of the things we need to think about is, you know, there are some things that are common to a lot of women's experiences and that universities need to battle with around stereotypes, around sexual and harassment and sexual assault and domestic violence. But we also need to make sure that gender equality is the tide that lifts all boats. And some of the forward strides that we made have not been made equally by all women. And sometimes have been deliberately made at the exclusion or expense of other women. So there's been a really excellent documentary in Australia recently on women in Parliament. Australia was the first country in the world that both allowed women to vote and to stand for Parliament. New Zealand was the first to allow women to vote. But part of the argument for that was for white women to be able to vote in contrast to women of colour. You know, that was actually deliberately making the case on racial grounds as well as gender. So, you know, women like me benefited at the expense of other women. So that's something that I think we really grappling with and trying to make sure that when we're thinking about these issues, we're thinking about them in terms of our policy on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander inclusion, disabilities inclusion, and thinking about some of the stereotypes that might play that are not just gender-based. The second issue I wanted to raise was, you know, our numbers at aggregate are very good. So if you look at Griffith, we've got about 45% of the senior academic positions are women, close enough to 50% of the senior professional staff roles are women, and more than 50% of the senior executive roles are women. So, you know, that's a huge distance to have travelled, and great credit to the generations of women who came before who allowed for that. But when you look at our engineering school as compared to our nursing school, you'll see both the student and the staff body look really very different. And there are some areas like my own of law that started as very, very male in terms of both student body and the professoriate, and have really broken those gender barriers down now to be roughly equal. But there are still a lot of stereotypes that push women into certain sorts of careers, into certain sorts of jobs. As Professor Ghosh said, not law, not policy. That, you know, there's the olden days when they said women couldn't do these jobs or were prohibited from that. You know, that's all long gone. So it's a much more difficult job of looking at the stereotypes that push people into certain directions, both girls and boys, because I think we're missing girls in the STEM subjects, and that's a problem. But I actually think missing boys in the HASS subjects is a problem as well. And so and then the final thing I'll just quickly say is, you know, one of there's no magic bullet to any of this. The sort of easy work of getting rid of outwardly discriminatory policies is gone. Now it's the sort of hard work of looking at all of our laws and policies and practices and way we do things around here and the culture through a gendered lens, but not only a gender lens, to see how they might be inadvertently benefiting certain groups at the expense of others. And we've come a long way in doing that in Australia and at Griffith, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Evans. I see, before I came here, I used to work at in Newcastle in Australia and in Sydney, and I can see some of the issues that you talk about coming through. One of the things that you all mentioned here was this notion of stereotypes. It was sort of coming out from the discussions and the policies and practices. And I'm wondering here, what do you think? I think, Carolyn, you mentioned just earlier that the hard work, certainly, and I think Professor Ghosh also, this came through even in the Indian context, certainly legislatively, regulatory policy-wise at some level, it's all hunky-dory. If I think the quote which I liked was, "Officially things are fine." But we do have these persistent stereotypes, and we can sort of break them down into different sort of buckets, if we want to put it that way. At some level, certainly, I think at Otago and in the US and in Australia, the discussion is the splintering of gender, right? The splintering into diverse genders. And whilst that's coming through in an Indian context too, the issue at some level is actually, whilst things are fine at the official level, breaking it down to making sure that there's more equitable policies, procedures, workplaces for both staff and students. And I'm wondering, I want to touch on this notion of stereotypes, and then we'll move into policies in a moment and structural changes. So just very quickly, I'll start off with you, Carolyn, if I can get your viewpoint on so gendered stereotypes and how they may or may not persist as you see them at the executive levels in the tertiary sector that you deal with in Australia, and sort of what kind of collective efforts and mindset changes are required perhaps in order to see more gender diversity in the sort of current way we might talk about it. Not, I think, as you rightly said, women are coming through, and I think even Helen mentioned it, but women of a certain socioeconomic class, race background. So how might we actually move toward that in terms of stereotypes? And then I want to then take the conversation afterwards, and this might be a point to prime yourselves, into the structural changes. So first stereotypes, and then once we've moved around that issue, we'll move into the structural changes. Over to you, Carolyn.
Thank you. So one of the other speakers, I'm sorry, I've forgotten which, sort of mentioned that this starts well before universities, and the moment of coming into universities can and should be a transformative moment. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do educationally, is make people think in different ways. But, one of the things that we see in terms of stereotypes in Australia is about girls and maths. And there are a lot of studies now to show that from a very young age, the girls start getting the message that they're not as good at maths, or maths a bit hard for them, or it's all right for girls to give up on maths, but, boys should be pushed to move on. And that means that they give up studying too early, and they then close themselves off from a whole lot of options, or make it much harder to take up a whole range of options, which of course then flows off into universities. So universities, I think, have a responsibility to not just look at our own institution, but to think about how we engage with the whole pipeline and the broader social context. Certainly we have some programs here that do that, to try and encourage and support different ways of thinking about those opportunities. Yeah. Inside universities themselves, I think one of the stereotypes has been particularly about women who have children, and assumptions about what a normal professor looks like. And I'll just give you one example of one is talking about lots of little policy changes rather than one big silver bullet. But for people in teaching and research roles, the sabbatical can be really important. That's the time you get to finish your book or write up the papers or get a bit of international profile. But pretty commonly in Australian policy, the requirement was that you go overseas. So you spend 3 or 4 months overseas, university will give you financial support, sometimes even financially support your family. But it was assumed that there was a person with a primary career, and if they said, oh, I'm going to head off to New York now on a sabbatical, everybody else would be able to pack up and follow them, i.e. the wife and kids. And so those people who were in that position, which included women who weren't partnered or without families, and they were fine under the policy. But that sort of stereotyped assumption that a real professor was somebody who could be infinitely mobile and didn't have any family responsibilities clashed with the reality for a lot of women. And so a really simple policy change that a number of universities made, which I certainly benefited from, was say you don't actually have to go overseas. If you can spend some time off focusing on your research, or you can go overseas for shorter periods. So for my sabbaticals, I would often go on 2 1-week sabbaticals, which I could manage childcare and working around and so forth. And that allowed me to finish a book. It allowed me to write a couple of important articles. It allowed me to do some international connections. But I think that can be one of the real issues. The other thing which I just battle against all the time, because I hate whenever you hear this, she's very ambitious. I've never heard it said about a man, oh, he's very ambitious, like that's a bad thing. But this sense that a woman, if she's nice, is not ambitious. And it's almost impossible to get anywhere without a bit of ambition. And so that's something I sort of keep coming back to in job interviews and in ways that people are describing people. Yeah, of course she's ambitious. That's how she got to be a Vice-Chancellor. That's how she got to be the lead academic in her field. That's how she got to be the chair of the International Committee. Same way as all of the men who are. So I'll stop.
Can I just tease out very quickly before I move on to Rekha? Are you suggesting then that that's a very overtly sort of discussed, outwardly discussed as a negative, or is it more covert, in the sort of corridor chats and so on?
And again, I don't want to suggest we're still in the same position we were 20, 30 years ago. When I started in a law firm where they had one female partner, and when they got a second, they thought that was a crazy feminist revolution that, who knows where it would all end. But yeah, I think people, just when they're discussing if someone will be a good fit, that sort of notion of cultural fit is important in job interviews, but can be used in a very destructive way and a very negative way. It is not uncommon to hear women, adjectives that are attached to women, and ambition is one of them, but not the only one, that would be seen as a positive in men, that are just said, it's, I don't know, seems a bit ambitious. Will people like that? A bit pushy, bossy. Well, you're putting her in for a leadership role, and exactly the same behaviours, if manifested by a man, would be seen as, he's got a lot of drive, got a lot of ambition, to get up and go, clearly a natural leader. So again, it's changing over time. You don't see that as much anymore, but it's still, when we think about stereotypes, that's how do you have an image in your head of a woman who is a leader? If you've got an image in your head that women have to always be kind and soft and nice and, not make any hard decisions and not put themselves forward for roles and those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, thank you. They're fascinating insights. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to jump ahead to one of the next questions I wanted to, because that's a nice segue to talk. And it's interesting, we've now got Rekha, who comes from a political science and sociology background as well. And I want, if you could sort of, from your lens in the US, but even more generally, given the global higher education discourse, give us some insights on how, for example, stereotypes might then either push against or be absorbed into the structural changes that we see that are implemented by institutions in the higher education space. And so I'm interested in that sort of tension of, how some of the stereotypes might persist despite some of the structural changes, or do they actually help manifest the change themselves?
So thank you again. I'm struggling a little here because to me it's very difficult to separate some of the stereotypes from the systemic and cultural changes. So we have, as was pointed out several times, we've made progress, sometimes slow, sometimes really remarkable, in giving access to girls' education in many parts of the world. But even in, if you take the American context, I cited some trends in female education, but when you divide it again by disciplines, you do see, some discrepancy there in terms of women to this day opting for careers even within the sciences. There is a kind of, in the health sciences, there's more women than in engineering. And then, so that's going on. So these intersections are what I'm struggling with. And on the other hand, like, excuse me, excuse me, it's like 4 a.m. waking up at 4 a.m. It doesn't suit my constitution. But anyway, as Caroline mentioned, even though women are, taking on more and more leadership positions, I have to go back to the, and again, in the US context, maybe that's more relevant, that we have to also look at the minority representation in those leadership positions, and not just gender. As of 2016, there was only 7% of higher education administrative positions, including top executives, administrative officers, division heads, deans, you name every administrative position, which were held by Black staffers. Now that is really an eye-opening kind of statistic. Only 3% of those jobs were held by Hispanic or Latino people, 2% were Asian, and 1% identified as other race or ethnicity. So again, that intersection is what I'm struggling with at the leadership levels, in the disciplinary levels, in the career choices. And I can't wait for this discussion to go on to the systemic and cultural, because I do think that that's very critical, even in terms of influencing stereotypes as well as policies.
So where do you think then the work needs to be done there? If if we still, those figures are hugely revealing about the representative in senior admin positions by, dare I say, ethnicity and the intersection of gender and ethnicity. Where do you think the work needs to be done there? Like, at what level, or is it sort of, yeah, I'll let you take it forward.
Yeah, I don't mean to sound critical that nothing has been done. I do think that, culture change, system changes, they take a long time. And if you think a policy change takes a long time, it's nothing compared to these, socioeconomic, cultural kinds of changes. They need a long time to transform, if you will. And some transformation is happening. It may take decades, it may take longer, but that's where it has to happen, is in the systemic and in the structural inequalities, in inequities. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. Even if you look at senior admin or academic positions, there's also a gap in equity, in pay equity, in salary equity when it comes to gender and maybe even race. So there's so many kinds of layers of inequities, and it's not like, as Dr. Ghosh had mentioned early on, it's not like there's a conscious discrimination going on, but you would ask, if the policy is there in terms of pay equity, why is it not happening, right? So there are these intersections of culture and system, structural inequalities, and as well as socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful insights. If I can ask Helen to take, from your snapshot in New Zealand, where, just leaping off from Professor Rekha's comments, how would you see, if it indeed is structural and social, what might be some of the things that need to be done? Is it as simple as, for example, shifting policy, or is it also in terms of, I'm not saying that's simple, but in terms of sort of seeding the culture, so it's sort of like almost like a 10 or 15 year campaign, if you put it that way. I'm a marketing professor, so it sort of tends to look at, and I look at, say, for example, quite honestly, I look at, say, the global LGBT movement. And, if you go back to Australia and New Zealand, just 20 years ago, things weren't looking too great. And then probably from the late 2000s to the late 2010s, we just had a remarkable shift, right? And that was deliberate too. It wasn't, so I'm just wondering, do people need to play an active role here? Do we need to get involved in terms of, yeah, as I said, seeding campaigns to change the culture and change the mindset, so that we get more females working in STEM, or studying STEM degrees, for example, working in STEM afterwards, and conversely, more males working toward the HAS sort of sector as well.
Yeah. Okay, so it's not simple. And as Professor Ghosh said, we have policies. So if you looked at our governmental policies, they are promoting equity, if not equality. But it is around culture, and it starts with the families, it starts with the schools. And in some of our schools, particularly so we have both co-ed and single-sex schools. In some of our single-sex schools, girls won't have the same opportunities to do science subjects, so they're immediately disadvantaged at that stage. I think when they come to university, it's important that we have role models, that we put our good female academics in front of those, particularly first years, to actually encourage them. In terms of staff, I mean, it is I think to a certain extent we've had to grow our own, and the same is true if I think of our Maori and Pacific staff, our Indigenous peoples, because you have to start at the beginning, because you can go out and you can advertise and you can have affirmative action, but if the women don't apply, you can't appoint them. So it is a question of starting early on and growing our next group of leaders. There are stereotypes, and I think the sabbatical leave is one of those things that certainly has affected me too. The ability to work flexible hours is particularly important for women in the early stages of the career where they've got young family. You can't necessarily work 9 to 5, and you can't go to those meetings that start at 5:30 where many of the men network. So you have to find other opportunities for women to be able to network, which fits in with either their children, or often they can be looking after older, family members as well. So it's thinking creatively around how some people need to work. And it's, increasingly, it's not just women who are looking after the children or looking after elderly relatives, but we have to think about those things more creatively, I think. And then going back to the senior leadership, sometimes, there's evidence that women don't go forward for promotion until they're ready, whereas men will often go and they'll give it a go and they don't care if they're knocked back. So I think there's mentorship that needs to go in, and supporting those women to apply when they're ready and not when they're over ready. And at that very senior level, often the culture can be quite blokey, quite male, and some women don't think that they want to be part of that. So how do we actually create the culture where women want to be part of that, rather than being the single woman or the a minority female in what's a very male culture?
Yes. It's a point I hear across many sectors, actually, that point as well. The blokiness at some level, is sort of not a turn off, but it's a barrier to sort of move toward. Yeah. Thank you for those insights. Wonderful. I'm going to throw it over to Professor Ghosh to wrap it up here. Like from India, how do you think, we do have persistent stereotypes around gender, and, India is sort of, even from the many parts of the West, seen as, the center for STEM. How do we move beyond that to produce, say, people who might, females who might want to enter the sector like yourself, and move beyond that, move beyond just being a student working in an industry to taking leadership positions?
A lot has changed in India, but not as much as I'm hearing from the co-panelists, as you are aware. Societal changes here are slow and often incremental and not unidirectional. We often go back and forth on issues. So technology has helped in making it somewhat level playing, neutral field. That's something I think we have not touched upon. And I think that's what I see a lot. Physical abilities, who is a thin boy or a masculine boy, doesn't really matter. My time when I have to lift a pump, I have to always call my friend from the next lab. So those things do not matter anymore. And as was pointed out, because technology has made it possible for women to do a lot more, or weak people to do a lot more with their brain and other abilities. So I think that's something that's good. I'm not going to elaborate on that. Everybody understands it. So let me just go back and address your question. We still have very poor working conditions for women. One, I've talked about in government forum on this. It's an international forum. Let me just say security aspects, right? I cannot work alone late night in the lab. That's one thing that's a societal problem in this. Second is no proper childcare facilities. I'm not talking about Jindal or Shiv University. I mean, that's the first thing I did. But it's not possible. Lack of mobility because of family responsibilities, you lose out on promotions because maybe the promotion is another city. And the last one that everybody knows, and I'm going to give you an example of how misplaced policies can be. Maternity leave, that leads to career break. Okay, so paying the salaries of 2 employees for the same job while one is away on maternity leave can stop people from employing young women. And this is happening. So effective, it was 2017. So I think 1st April 2017, our Union Labor Ministry increased the length of maternity leave from 12 to 26 weeks. So 6 months. This was done through an amendment in the Maternity Benefit Act. Now, there was a study done, I think, last year, so 2020, maybe in March, it came out in trade briefs that small firms in India admit to hiring fewer women because of maternity leave costs. This came out of their survey. So the 2017 Maternity Benefits Act, which increased maternity leave from 12 weeks to 26 weeks, was pointed as a major reason for this reduction in women hires. So it was done all in good faith, but they did not consult the people that were to be consulted. If you are in STEM in particular, that matters because you have to be often at the bench working, in the lab working. You don't want to be out for 26 weeks. That's the end of your career. So I think the idea is to give them flexibility. So not let women to continue to face discrimination, forcing many to quit work. And they also remain fearful of using their full quota of maternity leave. So I've been saying this for a very long time, that the term maternity leave remains highly gendered, right? So it harms women by raising the cost of hiring them. This should be changed to family leave, which can be shared by the parents based on their needs. I mean, why do I want to get inside a family dynamics and dictate to them who should do what? I don't want to do it. But even in SNU, where I have a policy that talks about a family leave, under family leave, under different categories, I have to actually follow the government policies because our HR otherwise goes crazy. So based on their needs, medical requirements, negotiations at the workplace, they can figure it out so that all key projects, including the infant's welfare, can be served well. I mean, this is done in other countries, but I think it was not done in India. Second thing so this is a very, very important point that affects everybody. And when you are well-meaning, this is what you don't want to do. I want to point out one more thing. It's actually a lack of an affirmative action. We are actually asking for that. I don't believe in reservations, but affirmative actions are something that I strongly support of the right kind. There are age cutoffs for prestigious awards and fellowships. I mean, you want to be the Associate Fellow of Indian Academy of Sciences, that has 35 years. DST Sharna Jayanti Fellowship has 40 years. Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar, which is the Nobel of India, is 45 years. I think this should be extended for women and men who have had children to attempt to level the playing field for women and those who had to compensate for their time away from work. It's a very simple suggestion. This is one way that you can actually appreciate and have more role models. And I think the last point I want to make is really that this is sheer utter lack of role models, almost invisible role models in India. So women who make it to the top have a major role to play in empowering other women. So women leaders must drive the change and lead the chain of empowerment. So, one is, but should not be limited by others' opinions about their capabilities.
Yeah. No,
I think that's the thrust of it. Yeah. Okay. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. They're fascinating. I'm going to now, just because of the paucity of time, we could go on. And I know Rekha's, well, I don't think she wants to go on, but we apologize for the time as well. But in terms of wrapping up, I want to pose a very quick question to all of you. And some of the issues have already been teased out, but I'd like, your sort of succinct sort of response around this. One of this is coming from one of the audience questions, actually. And we sort of talked a lot here, and I want to bring it back into something a bit more focused. So particularly around the title of the session, which was around ungendering, right? So the question is, the idea of unstated discrimination, which many here have spoken about, is interesting. How can universities develop a culture of ungendering? How can universities be an agent for change in bringing a change in their own campus and in the larger social context, let's just say within the nation that you're speaking from? So I'll throw it over to Rupamanjari very quickly. How would you say, when we're talking about engendering, how can universities engage in that and actively develop a culture of engendering?
In the university sector, the most important sector is the faculty. I would start talking about that, and I think in just 10 seconds, is basically the idea is we wish to engage the very best people, not just the best men and then the next best men and then the next best men. And this is to stay competitive in business. We cannot be competitive in a global economy if not half in India, but half of our human capital is not allowed the opportunity to work up to its potential. Simple message. And I think we have to harp on it and have to do it repetitively. It's a process that you can't take satisfaction that, okay, I had done these training sessions, I've done this orientation session. It's a fluid population and you have to do it repeatedly. And in India, we have a particular problem because, it has to go back and forth for people to realize the society, technological solutions are easy to come. Societal solutions take much harder. So I think that's where the problem is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Can I throw it over to Helen? What about ungendering? How can, say, Otago help be an active agent in that, within, say, the university space? What do you see as some of the ways the university can bring change?
So I think universities are there to educate, and our Education Act also asks us to be the critic and conscience of society. So our role is to actually educate. So that means educating our staff, working with our staff in staff development training, because I think our role is to be informed and to counter the biased opinions and misinformation of others. Yeah. So that we have to call people out when they are behaving in inappropriate ways. And that has to come from the top and it has to go all the way down.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I like that idea of the critic and conscience. I really like that. And staff development. Wonderful. Rekha, from your point of view at Monmouth in the US, how can the university be an active agent for change?
Yeah, I'll start with saying that I agree with all of the above. And I'd like to add, we could do a better job focusing on our disciplines and looking at, in ungendering the disciplines themselves. And that could lead to, earlier you had asked about stereotypes. Some of the stereotypes could be addressed that way as well, that, leading scientists and engineers have been women, and how we can really encourage that. And also within the disciplines, again, looking at syllabi and how we can ungender the syllabi from that perspective, I think would help. And we could discuss that more.
Wonderful, please. Thank you. Thank you. Carolyn, Australia and Griffith, I'm just conscious we're just running out of time. So what would be your 15-second elevator pitch?
Yep. I'm not comfortable with the term ungendering, just by the way. Sounds a little like covering up to me. I prefer to think about gender inclusive. It's to make issues transparent, make pay gaps transparent, make impacts of policies on a range of different genders transparent, and get people to face the consequences of the decisions that they make fully, rather than allowing a lot to simply go by without having people aware of the impact of what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And that just Rekha mentioned something similar. So I think that's really important, particularly from an executive level, as you say, holding people to account. Very important. Thank you very much. I know we could spend so much time unpacking the issues. We've only just really scratched, and I apologize for the time differences as well. But it's been wonderful. It's been enlightening for me. I'm sure our audience members and our students and stakeholders and staff will also have many different insights to take away from that. I really appreciate your time, Rupamanjari, Helen, Rekha and Carolyn. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the insights in the chat, and good evening, good morning, and good night to all of you.